Welcome to the video. My name is Aleksi and on this channel I cover all things Azure. In this video I'm going to cover Data Factory parameters and variables. These two concepts are crucial to learn in order to build more dynamic and efficient pipelines in Data Factory. This video is part of my Data Factory tutorial series, and if this is the first video you are watching from me, I would highly recommend to check out the playlist on my channel that has many more Data Factory related videos. And now let's dive into Data Factory parameters and variables. Let's start with our setup here. We have two storage accounts, and in both of those storage accounts we have blob containers. In the first blob container we have two files. We have file 1 underscore source.txt and file 2 underscore source.txt, and we would like to copy these files to our second blob container and just change the underscore source into name to underscore sync. And because this is Data Factory series, we are going to use Data Factory pipeline to do this binary copy for us. First, we would have to create two datasets to Data Factory to describe the source files. Then, we would have to create another two datasets into Data Factory to describe the sync files. After this, we can configure two copy activities to copy these files from the source blob container to the sync blob container. This setup is all good and fine and does the job. But if we would like to reduce the amount of Data Factory objects that are being used here, like the datasets, we can use Data Factory parameters to do that. Now let's go through how we would do it. So let's get rid of all of these datasets. And now let's add just one parameterized dataset describing the source, and let's do that same thing for the sync dataset. In this case, we don't hard code any file name values for these datasets. Instead, we add a parameter called file underscore name that can be used to input the file name dynamically for these datasets. And now we can decide which source file and which sync file names we are going to pass down for these datasets to configure the copy activity. And with this setup, both of our copy activities are actually using the same source dataset and same sync dataset, but with just different parameter values for those datasets. But there is actually a way to simplify this even more, and we can use just one copy activity to handle this whole pipeline. So we can get rid of these two copy activities and replace them with just one copy activity. In this case, we can use pipeline level parameters and pass them down to this pipeline and dynamically decide which source dataset we are going to copy to which sync dataset. So let's add source file name and sync file name as our pipeline level parameters to this pipeline. Now we can pass these parameters down to our pipeline, and from the pipeline we can pass these down to our copy activity and to the datasets. And now we can dynamically change the file that will be used as a source and the file that is used as a sync. And this way we can significantly reduce the amount of Data Factory objects like datasets that we have to create, and also the activities that we have to use. I understand that this can seem a bit confusing at first, but when we get to the Data Factory demo part of this video, then this will hopefully become a lot clearer how this parameterization and passing down those parameters works in action. Now let's take a look at different parameters that we have in the Data Factory. First, we could parameterize the linked service and, for example, parameterize the database that is being used on the SQL server. Then we have the dataset parameters that we just went through in the previous example, that we can, for example, parameterize the file name or even the blob container that is being used to fetch the data. Then we have the pipeline level parameters that we also covered in that previous example. So we can pass down some parameters for the pipeline when we are running it, and for example say that copy this file to this sync using those parameter values. Lastly, we have global parameters in Azure Data Factory. These are the parameters you can set at the Data Factory level, and they are available all over the Data Factory, so you can reference them anywhere you want. Next, let's cover the different data types that we have available for the parameters in Data Factory. First, we have the string type. This is basically your basic text parameter, so you can type some text to this parameter and give it as a value for it. Then we have integer type parameters. These are basically your whole numbers or negative numbers, basically 1, 2, 3 or -1, -2, -3, and so on. Then we have float values. These are your floating point values, meaning numbers with decimals. Then we have Boolean parameters. These are your true and false values. Then we have array type parameters, and this is basically your list type parameter in Data Factory, and you can use these for many cool things that we are gonna cover in the future. Then we have object type parameters, so you can pass down some object values as parameters. And if you're familiar with JSON objects, this basically means passing down JSON as parameter. And lastly, we have secure string parameter that will actually mask your values that you input to that parameter. Along with parameters, we also have variables in the Data Factory. Variables are similar to parameters, but the main difference is that these values are defined during the pipeline execution, and they are not passed down to the pipeline like parameters. Supported data types for variables are a bit more restricted than with parameters, so variables only support string, integer, boolean, and array values. We also have quite a variety of system variables available in Data Factory. These could be your pipeline name or Data Factory name, to name a two that are available. The most important activity from the variable point of view in the Data Factory is the set variable activity. This is used for setting the variable values. Also, this allows setting pipeline return values that we are not going to cover in that much detail in this video, but basically pipeline return values would allow you to send a return value from a nested pipeline to a pipeline that is calling the nested pipeline. But this we will cover in much more detail in upcoming videos. Then we have an append variable activity, and this only supports array type variables, and with this you can append values in the array type variables, and this can come handy if you need to create array dynamically during the pipeline execution. Now we have covered the Azure Data Factory parameters and variables on a conceptual level. So next, let's open up our Azure portal and our Data Factory to see how these concepts work in action. Now we are in the Azure portal, and I have already created two blob containers for us to use in this demo. We have tutorial 5 source and tutorial 5 sync. To the tutorial 5 source container, I have already added 2 text files and added some random content inside those text files. The content in this case doesn't really matter, since we are doing binary copies and we are not caring about the data inside those files. And our sync container is still empty. And now we would like to copy some data over to this sync container using parameterized Data Factory pipeline. So let's open up our Data Factory. Let's start by creating a new folder for our tutorial 5. Into this folder, let's create a new pipeline and name our pipeline according to our naming conventions. And then let's create a copy activity to this pipeline. Let's name our copy activity to copy data from source blob to sync blob. And now we would have to configure the source and the sync dataset for this copy activity. And now the goal here would be able to use this same copy activity to copy both of these files according to our pipeline parameters. So first, let's create a folder for our datasets called tutorial 5. Let's create our first datasets. Let's select Azure Blob Storage, and then let's select binary, and let's name our dataset according to our naming conventions. Then let's select our linked service that is pointing to our blob storage, and now let's go and find our container that we're going to use as a source, but let's not select any files here, since we want to dynamically change the file name. And to this file name value, we do not want to hard code any file names. So we can open the parameters tab of this dataset. And to the parameters tab, let's create a new parameter called file name. And then we can go back to the connection tab and use this file name as a dynamic content for our file name here. We're not going to cover this dynamic content in that much detail in this video, but I will briefly explain that this dynamic content allows the use of dynamic values in the Data Factory. And in this dynamic content, we have also a lot of built-in functions that Data Factory offers us to build our dynamic content using those functions. But we will come back to this dynamic content in later videos. For now, it is enough for us to know that this dynamic content allows us to use parameters to replace the values in the Data Factory. Now we can select our dataset parameter called file_name that we just created. And now we can go back to our pipeline and select our dataset that we just created. And after selecting our dataset, we can see that our dataset has now a new property called file_name that we can use to pass down the value that we want for that dataset. In this case, we want to pass down the file name for this dataset. Next, we want to create a pipeline level parameter to this pipeline. So we can click anywhere in the empty space of the pipeline development view, which will take us to the pipeline level properties. Here we have the parameters. Let's create a new parameter for this pipeline. Let's call this source file name. And we want to have this parameter as string type, since we will be passing down string values that describe the file name to this pipeline. Now we can go back to our copy activity and select our source dataset and pass down this pipeline level parameter to our dataset. And the process what will happen here is that the parameter is defined on the pipeline level, then it is given as parameter to our dataset, then it will figure out dynamically the file it needs to fetch from the blob storage according to that parameter. And now we have configured the source dataset parameter correctly. So let's do the same operation with our sync dataset. So let's create our sync dataset. Let's select Azure blob storage and then the binary again, and let's name our dataset. And same thing here, and let's find our container, and in the sync container we don't have any files yet because we're gonna copy some files there. So okay, and let's create our dataset, and again let's create a new parameter called file_name for this as well, and let's pass it to our file name in our file path. And now let's go back to our pipeline and let's configure this sync dataset here, and it has also the parameter value here. So let's go to the pipeline parameters and let's define new pipeline level parameter and call this sync_file_name. And now we would like to pass down this to our sync dataset. So let's go there and use the dynamic content to pass down the sync file name parameter for this dataset. Okay, so now we have configured everything for this copy activity. We have the pipeline level parameters, and now we can debug our pipeline in order to see what happens. And now when we click the debug button, the Data Factory will actually prompt us with this pipeline parameter view that will ask values for these parameters that we are using for this pipeline. So for the source file name, we want to first input the file one_source.txt, and then the sync file name, we're going to input file one_sync.txt. So we will be copying the file one to our sync and just renaming the source to sync in that file name. And after we have defined those, we can click OK, so the debug run will start. And now our debug run is running. This should only take a couple of seconds to run, since we're only moving a few bytes of data from the blob storage to the same blob storage. And now our debug run is done, and we can check that files read was 1 and files written was 1. And now we can actually go to our sync container and see that we have a new file there, and we have here file_sync.txt. So according to this, everything worked fine and we were able to copy this file to our sync. Now let's go back to the Data Factory and let's repeat this same process, but now let's modify the parameters. And now we want to copy the file 2_source.txt to our sync and name it file2_sync.txt. And let's click OK and start running our pipeline. Again, this should only take a couple of seconds, since the amount of data that is being moved is so small. And now our pipeline is already done. And let's check the log. Again, one file copied and one file written. So according to this, everything worked fine. And we can go back to our sync container and refresh the view and see that now we have there 2 files. So now we have copied successfully the both files to our sync container using the same Data Factory pipeline by just dynamically deciding which file we're going to copy. And now then we have tested that our fabulous pipeline works, we can go to the Data Factory and publish our changes, so it will save these pipelines and datasets to our Data Factory. Next, let's quickly check where we can find our global parameters for the data factory. So we can go to the Manage tab, and here we can find global parameters. And here we can define new global parameter for our data factory. As an example, let's define environment parameter for our data factory, and let's have that as a string type. As a value, we can add demo, since this is our demo environment for these tutorials. So let's add the global parameter called environment as a value demo to this data factory. Then we can go back to our data factory pipeline and click our copy data and check our dataset parameters. And here we can see that now we have a global parameter called environment available. And if we would choose this to be the file name, it would set it as to be demo, like we defined in the global parameters. But since we don't have a file called demo, there is no point for us to assign that value to this pipeline. So let's just click cancel. Next, we can check out the linked service parameters. So let's go back to our Manage tab, open linked services, and let's open our blob storage linked service. And here we can also find parameters. Here we can, for example, define as an example ls underscore parameter and have it set. And then let's go back to our pipeline and see how this linked service parameter would behave. Here we can see that our activity does not have a new parameter defined here in the dataset properties. But if we open the dataset itself, here we can see that we have linked service properties, and here we can define the value for the linked service parameter. And here we can basically type whatever we want, because that parameter is not really used anywhere in the linked service, so it doesn't really matter what we input here. Also, even though this linked service parameter is not available in the dataset properties in the pipeline level, there is a way for us to get that show up there. And this will require us to go to the dataset parameters and define a new parameter there, and then we can use this parameter to pass down values for this linked service parameter in this dataset. So now if we go back to our pipeline and select our copy activity, we can see that this dataset has now a new parameter, that is the ls underscore parameter that we just created, that we can use to pass down values from the pipeline to that linked service. I hope this example highlights that we can have these parameters on many different levels on Data Factory and use these parameters to pass down values from one Data Factory object to another. So here we are basically passing down parameters from the pipeline level to dataset level to linked service level, and the same value would go through this whole process. And in these examples, we have just scratched the surface what we can do with the Data Factory's dynamic content and parameters, that we can build way more dynamical pipelines in the later videos. So this video is just a small stepping stone for a lot of cool stuff that we're gonna do in upcoming videos. Now let's do a quick demo to demonstrate how the variables work in the Data Factory. Let's start by creating a new pipeline for our second demo in this video. Let's first name our pipeline. Then let's navigate to our activities and open the General Activities tab. And here we can find the set variable activity. Let's add one set variable activity to our pipeline. This set variable activity allows us to set pipeline variable values. But here, if we open the Settings tab, we can see that we have no variables available. This means that our pipeline doesn't have any variables created. So we have to create one. Now again, like with the parameters, let's click somewhere in our pipeline development view to open pipeline settings, and then we can open the variables tab here. Let's create a variable called variable1, and then we can check all the different data types that are available for the variable. But for now, we want to just use the string type for our variable. Next, we can go to our set variable, and now we can open the settings, and now we have the variable 1 available. Now we can add some value to our variable 1. We can open the dynamic content tab and see what options we have available here. In the parameters, we only have the global parameter available, since we haven't defined any parameters for this pipeline, but we have defined the global parameter to this data factory in the previous demo that we did. Then we have also a bunch of system variables that we can use to assign values for this variable. We have, for example, the data factory name, pipeline group ID, pipeline run ID, and so on. And for the demonstration purposes, we're going to assign the data factory name to this variable. Next, let's create the second variable to this pipeline. Let's call that variable 2. And then let's add a second set variable activity and go to the settings tab and select variable 2. And now let's configure some value for this. And now let's just write some random text to this value section of this set variable activity to assign this random text to this variable 2 as value. And then we can create a third variable to this pipeline. Let's call that variable 3. By the way, this variable 1, 2, and 3 is not very good naming convention for variables, so I'm just using this for illustration purposes, but please try to come up with more descriptive names to your variables than these. And to this third variable, we're actually going to assign a pipeline parameter value. So let's go to pipeline parameters and let's create a new parameter. Let's call this parameter 1. And let's assign a default value for this parameter so we can see what that does. So let's just write some text there. And this text we will assign to our variable 3. So let's go to our variable 3, select the dynamic content and select parameter 1 as value for this variable. Now we have set up the 3 variables to this pipeline. So we can click debug, and as we can see, our default value for this parameter is already available in our parameters, so we do not have to change it. Of course, we could replace this default value with anything we want at this stage, but now we can go with just the parameter default value. So let's run our pipeline. And our pipeline finishes immediately because we have just some set variable activities here. And now we can see the outputs of those set variable activities. Our variable 1 output is our data factory name, like we defined. And our variable 2 value is some text here that we wrote to the value field in that set variable activity. And our third variable value is the parameter value that we wrote to the parameter default value. So everything worked fine and we have defined some values for our variables. Now that we could actually do that, we could drag a copy data activity to this pipeline and use these variable values in that copy activity, because these variables have been defined in this pipeline logical flow before this copy activity. As you can see, we can open the variables tab in this copy activity using the dynamic content and see that we have variables available here that we have created. However, we do not really want to add any copy activities to this pipeline, so let's just remove that copy activity for now. And now I have demonstrated to you how you can use set variable activities to set values to your pipeline variables. This is also just a scratch to the surface what comes to the variables, and in upcoming videos we are gonna use variables in way more complex situations to build way more dynamical and flexible pipelines to orchestrate and run your data pipeline flows in the Data Factory. Now we have covered the basics of Azure Data Factory, parameters and variables, and I know that for people not familiar with any programming languages, these concepts might be a bit hard to grasp. And I would highly recommend you to setting up your own data factory and test these concepts in action by yourself. Since in my opinion that is far the best way to learn these concepts, by trying them out yourself. If you enjoyed this video and found this information valuable, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel for more Azure and Data Factory content. Also, if you have any suggestions what you would like to see in the upcoming videos, please put some comments to the comment section down below. In the next video in this series, we are going to cover Data Factory dynamic content and the functions in way more detail. So stay tuned and see you in the next video.